Hello, I'm the Daily Storyteller, and I'm here to keep you company today. If you've visited my channel before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, I'm so glad to welcome you to the world of stories. I know many of you use these videos to relax or to help fall asleep more easily. So get comfortable, let your body relax, and allow the gentle sound of rain in the background to wash away your stress and worries. In this video, you'll hear chilling stories, most of them based on true events, told with honesty and depth. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Now then, let's begin. Story: The Midnight Caller. It was an ordinary night when everything changed. The kind of night that usually passed without notice. Quiet, peaceful, and without incident. The moonlight filtered through the curtains of my bedroom, casting faint shadows across the floor. I was just finishing up some late-night work, the soft click of the keyboard, the only sound breaking the silence. My phone sat on the desk, charging quietly as I glanced at the time. It was 2:15 a.m. I should have been asleep hours ago, but the pressing work on my desk kept me awake. That's when it happened. My phone buzzed. Not the usual notification or text alert, but the unmistakable sound of an incoming call. Strange, since I had no one I was expecting to hear from at this hour. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Curiosity made me answer it. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, the silence on the other end so thick I could almost hear my own breath. And then, a voice, low and steady, whispered in a chilling tone, "I know where you live." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the words settled in my mind. The voice was distant but clear. It was impossible to tell if the speaker was male or female, or even if it was a human at all. The static-filled silence between us was unbearable, and for a moment I almost thought I had imagined it. But then the voice spoke again, this time closer, almost as if it was right next to my ear. "I'm outside your window." My heart raced, and my skin prickled with cold sweat. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. Who was this? What did they want? My apartment was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be outside my window, I told myself. But something inside me wasn't convinced. "I'm watching you." The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. Panic surged in my chest. I quickly hung up, my hand shaking, the phone slipping out of my grasp. For a second, I sat there in the dark, staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. Who would do something like this? What kind of sick joke was this? I stood up and walked over to the window, my heart still pounding in my chest. I peered out into the night, straining my eyes to see any movement below. The street was empty. No cars, no people, only the flickering lights of nearby houses. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, trying to convince myself it was just some prank, maybe a wrong number. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection of the window, I saw a figure standing across the street, watching me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, standing still under the dim streetlight. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his eyes, gleaming with an intensity that made my stomach churn. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. He was watching me the whole time. He had been there all along, and I hadn't seen him until now. I quickly shut the blinds and backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I stumbled towards the door, trying to keep my composure, but my hands were trembling uncontrollably. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I grabbed my phone again, dialing 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was completely dead. Another call came in, this time from the same unknown number. I didn't pick it up. I was terrified. I turned off the lights and hid in my closet, my body shaking with fear. The seconds felt like hours, each minute dragging by slower than the last. The ringing of the phone continued until at last it stopped. But then I heard something else. Soft at first, barely a sound, a faint tap on the door. Then another, and another, growing louder, more insistent. My heart sank. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was outside. The knocks came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. Something sharp dragging against the wood of the door, slowly and methodically. It was deliberate. I could hear it clear as day. I held my breath, praying that whatever or whoever was out there would leave. I grabbed the nearest object in my closet, a small lamp, trying to steady my hands. My mind raced, thoughts blurring together in a desperate attempt to understand what was happening. Was it the same person from the phone call? Was this some sort of sick game? Or was this something far worse? The tapping continued. I dared not move. Not a single muscle twitched. I didn't want to alert the intruder. My mind kept repeating the same phrase, "Don't make a sound." The scraping sound stopped, but in its place, a deep voice, eerily familiar, drifted through the door. The voice from the phone. "I know you're in there." My breath hitched, my chest tightening as if someone was squeezing the air out of me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my mouth was dry, my throat tight with fear. How did they know where I was? How did they know I was hiding? I could hear footsteps now, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth just outside my door. They were waiting for me to do something, anything. But I remained motionless, trapped in the darkness of the closet, holding my breath, willing myself to become invisible. Then, without warning, the door handle turned. I could hear it. It was faint, but unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of a metal handle twisting slowly, the kind of noise you could hear on an old, rusty door. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I looked around the closet, as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. The small space I was huddled in was a prison, and I was its captive. The door creaked open, a sliver of light from the hallway spilling into the room. The figure from outside, the tall, gaunt man, was standing in the doorway, his eyes gleaming in the low light. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, as if he could see me, even though I was cloaked in shadow. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and for the first time I realized that there was something deeply wrong with his eyes. They weren't normal eyes. They were black, completely black, like the bottomless pits of some dark abyss. And they weren't just watching me, they were waiting for something. I dared not move a muscle. If I made a sound, if I even flinched, I knew it would be the end. His gaze never left mine, but there was something else. A presence in the air, thick and suffocating, like the world around me was closing in, and the shadows were alive. For what seemed like an eternity, he stood there, silent, watching me. Then, without a word, he slowly began to close the door again, but not before his voice rang out in the silence, a whisper so cold it made my skin crawl. "I'll be back." The door clicked shut with a finality that sent a jolt through my body. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no more sounds, just the eerie, bone-chilling silence that seemed to hang in the air. I didn't dare move. Not even when I heard the faint sound of a car starting in the distance, followed by the growl of an engine fading away into the night. The ringing of my phone broke the silence. It had started again, the same unknown number. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't, but I knew the truth now. Whoever this was, they weren't going away, and I wasn't safe, not in my own home. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, the weight of the night's events pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing once again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, frantically answering it, my voice trembling. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. That same low, chilling voice. "I told you I would be back. And I always keep my promises." A shiver ran down my spine. I looked around my apartment, half expecting him to be standing in the doorway, watching me as he had the night before, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence. But that silence felt different now. It was heavier, more suffocating. "I'm not done with you yet," the voice whispered. I hung up the phone immediately. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the device. My thoughts were a mess. What did he mean? What did he want from me? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing: he wasn't finished. And I didn't know how much longer I could stay in this house, wondering when he would come back. Story: The Haunted House on Oak Street. It was a cold, dreary autumn afternoon when I first saw the house on Oak Street. My husband and I had been searching for a place to settle down, something with character and history. And when we found this old, creaky house tucked away at the end of a quiet street, we thought we had found the perfect place. The house was large, with peeling paint on the exterior and ivy crawling up the sides. It had an eerie charm, as if it had been stuck in time. The real estate agent, a nervous woman with a thick accent, had warned us that the house had been on the market for over a year, but I was undeterred. The price was right, and the potential was clear. We could fix it up. But from the moment we moved in, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything too obvious at first. The creaking of the old floors, the occasional drafts in the walls, small things that could easily be explained away. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences began to build up. At night, I would hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the house. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, but the sound felt too real, too purposeful. One evening, as I sat reading in the living room, I heard a soft knock on the door. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, but when I opened it, no one was there. Just the faint smell of something sweet, like roses lingering in the air. I stood there for a moment, confused, before closing the door. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed, that I heard the knock again. This time, much louder. I got up, heart pounding in my chest, and walked cautiously to the door. When I opened it, nothing was there. But this time, I noticed something even stranger. The doorknob was ice cold, as though someone had just touched it. I told my husband about it the next morning, but he just shrugged it off, thinking I was imagining things. However, as the days passed, the noises grew worse. The whispers, the footsteps. And sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of something, someone, breathing softly right next to my ear. Each time, I would turn over, only to find nothing there. The worst night, though, came a few weeks later. I had gone to bed early, feeling exhausted from a long day of unpacking, My husband was out late with work, and I was alone in the house. As usual, I began to drift off to sleep, but something was different that night. I woke up suddenly, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the air itself had become thicker, heavier. The room seemed darker than it should have been, and my heart began to race for no reason. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from the wall next to my bed. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the noise stopped as soon as I focused on it. My pulse quickened, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But just as I was about to lie back down, the tapping began again, this time louder, more urgent. I got up and walked to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The tapping was coming from inside the wall. It was a steady rhythm, like someone was knocking from the other side, but that wasn't possible. No one else was in the house. I ran downstairs to check the front door and windows, but everything was locked tight. I returned to the bedroom, my heart racing. The tapping was still there, but now it was joined by something else. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, like a voice speaking in the dark. The words were too faint for me to make out, but the tone, low, guttural and cold, sent a chill down my spine. I was about to turn and leave the room when I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow, just a glimpse, standing by the window. I froze, staring at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow seemed to grow taller, thicker, until it was no longer just a shadow. It was a figure, standing motionless, watching me. Then, in a voice I'll never forget, the shadow whispered, "Leave this house. It's mine." I could feel my blood run cold as I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The figure didn't move, but the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the air. My whole body trembled as I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and everything went silent. I don't remember much of what happened after the door slammed shut. My mind went into a panic, and I don't know how long I sat on the floor, frozen in place, staring at the space where the shadow had stood. The room felt as though it were closing in on me, the air thick and suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. After a long moment of stillness, I slowly stood up, my legs shaky and weak. I could still feel the lingering cold from the shadow, and the whispering voice echoed in my ears. "Leave this house. It's mine." I had never heard a voice so full of malice before. I turned around, searching for anything that could explain what had just occurred, but there was nothing, nothing except the eerie stillness of the house. I rushed downstairs and tried calling my husband, but the phone line was dead. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air now, the chill creeping into my bones. As I stood in the living room, the floor creaked behind me, and I whipped around. Standing in the doorway was the same shadowy figure, now clearer, more defined, as if it were made of pure darkness. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, though his face was obscured in shadow. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with eyes that I could feel piercing into my soul. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, my mind screaming for me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The figure stepped forward, and I could hear his slow, deliberate footsteps, like the sound of nails scraping against stone. Each step sent a wave of terror through me, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into the abyss. He stopped just inches from me, and I could feel the air around him grow even colder. I tried to scream, but no sound came. It was as though my voice had been stolen by the presence of whatever this was. Then the figure spoke again, his voice deep and guttural, like the growl of a beast in the dark. "You should never have come here," he whispered. His breath was icy, and the words cut through me like a knife. I wanted to run, to flee, but I felt trapped, as though the house itself was holding me captive. The figure reached out a hand, long, twisted fingers stretching toward me. The cold radiating from him burned my skin like frostbite. I could feel my body trembling, every nerve alive with fear, but I couldn't pull away. The figure's hand brushed against my cheek, sending a jolt of terror through me. My vision blurred as I tried to break free, but my legs wouldn't obey. The world around me began to distort, the walls warping and shifting like they were alive. Suddenly, the figure jerked his hand back, and the room seemed to lurch violently. I stumbled backwards, crashing into the wall as the lights flickered and buzzed. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very weight of the house was pressing down on me. The whispering returned, louder this time. It wasn't just one voice now, but many, voices of children, of men and women, all speaking at once, filling my mind with their words. Some of them were begging for help, others were angry, their voices filled with rage and fear. I covered my ears, but the voices didn't stop. They got louder, more frantic, until they were all I could hear, drowning out everything else. I could feel the walls closing in, the house bending and shifting, as though it were alive, feeding on my fear. My mind was spiraling, the voices growing louder with each passing second, until I thought I might lose myself entirely. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The figure was gone, the voices faded, the room was silent once more. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was deafening, suffocating, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stood there, trembling, my body numb. I didn't know what to do. I had to leave. I had to get out of the house, but the door was locked. The windows were sealed shut. The house had trapped me inside, and I knew there was no way out. The figure had warned me. I should never have come here. But it was too late now. There was no escaping whatever had taken hold of this place, and I was certain that I wasn't alone. Story. Whispers in the dark. I had always been skeptical of things that go bump in the night. As a child, I feared the shadows and the strange noises that crept through the house when everyone else was asleep. But as I grew older, I realized those things were just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. There was always a logical explanation, a scientific reason for everything, or so I thought. That was until I moved into the old house on Sycamore Lane. It was a small, run-down place, with walls that creaked and groaned at the slightest movement. I rented it out cheaply after struggling to find a place, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. It was quiet, too quiet perhaps, but nothing to make me think anything was wrong. The neighborhood was mostly empty, and the house had an eerie charm to it, a lot of history, but no one seemed to know much about it. The first night I noticed something odd was around midnight. I was in bed reading a book when I heard it, the faintest of whispers. I thought it was the wind at first, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The voice was low, barely audible, but it was there. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the house settling. But as the days went by, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder. Sometimes they were so clear that I could make out words. "Come closer, one whisper would say. "Don't ignore me," said another. It wasn't just in the silence of the night. The whispers followed me. They echoed from the walls, the floorboards, even the ceilings. Every room in the house seemed to hum with the sound of unseen voices, each one pulling me deeper into a state of unease. One evening, after hearing the whisper again, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, heart racing, and followed the sound to the small closet in the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that opening it would only confirm what I feared. This house was haunted. With trembling hands, I reached for the door and pulled it open. The air inside was cold, colder than it had any right to be. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the usual clutter. Boxes of old clothes, books, forgotten knickknacks. The whispering had stopped. I thought I was going crazy, but then I heard it again. This time the whisper was louder, sharper. It came from behind me, from the dark recesses of the hallway. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it hissed. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but there was no one. Just the empty, dark hallway stretching out before me. The whispers faded, but now my heart was pounding. I closed the closet door with shaking hands and backed away slowly. I had to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. Something told me that if I left now, I might never escape what was haunting me. The air in the house felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides, trapping me inside. Later that night, as I tried to sleep, I felt it again. The whispers, but this time they were accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor of the bedroom. I held my breath, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks, but the sound grew louder, closer. I turned over in bed, too afraid to look, too afraid to see what was creeping toward me. The footsteps stopped at the edge of my bed, and the whispering began again. "Wake up!" it hissed, louder this time, as if right next to my ear. I bolted upright in bed, my eyes wide in terror. The room was empty. Nothing was there. But the feeling of dread, of being watched, was suffocating. I could hear my own breath as it came in short, shallow gasps. I looked around, trying to find something, anything that could explain this. That's when I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing in the doorway of the bedroom. A tall figure, its form indistinct, as though it were made of pure darkness. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my limbs frozen in place. The figure stepped forward, and I could hear its slow, deliberate footsteps, like the sound of nails scraping against stone. Each step sent a wave of terror through me, as if I were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into the abyss. He stopped just inches from me, and I could feel the air around him grow even colder. I tried to scream again, but the sound was strangled in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me. And then, in a voice that was no longer a whisper but a scream, it said, "You're mine." The room seemed to spin as I struggled to breathe. Every inch of my body screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure was so close now that I could feel the frost radiating from its form. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and I felt as though the walls of the room were closing in on me, suffocating me. "Leave this house," it said again, its voice no longer a whisper, but a guttural growl, low and menacing. "You don't belong here." With a force I didn't know I had, I broke free from the paralysis and bolted from the bed. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled across the room, trying to escape the creature that had haunted my every step. But as I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own, locking me inside. I pounded against the door, my voice raw as I screamed for help. But there was no one. The house was as silent as ever, save for the relentless whispering that filled my mind. In the darkness, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadowy figure loomed ever closer. It reached out a hand, long and bony, fingers like claws that seemed to stretch out of the darkness. I could feel its touch, cold and icy, as it brushed against my cheek. "You should have listened," the voice crooned, its tone mocking, cruel. "Now, you belong to me." I backed away from the figure, my mind racing for any way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls closing in on me from all sides. Every step I took seemed to only lead me further into the nightmare. Desperation began to set in. I had to get out. But how? The house had trapped me, and the creature knew it. I was its prisoner, locked in a cycle of terror I couldn't escape. The shadow advanced, and this time I could see its face, or what remained of it. It wasn't human. It was a grotesque mask of pure darkness, with hollow eyes that burned with an unholy fire. I could feel its gaze seeping into my soul, unraveling every ounce of my sanity. I turned to face the window, desperate for an escape, but it was too late. The room seemed to close around me, the walls and ceiling pressing in until there was nothing but the dark figure before me. I could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, each one more desperate than the last. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself entirely, a bright light filled the room, blinding me. The shadows screamed, a deafening shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The whispers ceased, and for a moment everything was still. The light faded as quickly as it had come, and I was left standing in the room, alone. The figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. But the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like the calm before the storm, like the house was waiting for me to let my guard down before it struck again. I ran out of the room, down the stairs and out the front door, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the street, the fresh air hitting my lungs like a breath of life. The house stood behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth. It wasn't over. The house had claimed me, and it would always be waiting for me. The whispers would come again, and the figure would return. And next time I might not escape. Story: The Man in the Shadows. It was an unusually cold evening for late spring. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. The storm had rolled in suddenly, leaving no time to prepare. The kind of night that seemed to have a life of its own, as if the universe had turned a page into something darker. I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book, the comforting glow of the fireplace flickering in front of me. My husband, Mark, was working late, so I had the house to myself for the evening. The storm was getting stronger, and the power had gone out shortly after I'd settled in. I had lit some candles to give the room a warm glow, but the flickering light only made the shadows on the walls seem deeper, longer. I tried to ignore the rising unease that was creeping over me. It was silly to be nervous when I was safe inside my own home. The house was quiet, but that kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like something is waiting for you to acknowledge it. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the wind against the walls, the distant thunder rolling in the sky. and then there was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But the sound was too distinct. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking across the hardwood floor in the hallway just outside the living room. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Mark wouldn't be home for another hour, and there was no one else in the house. I stood up slowly, the candlelight trembling as I moved, and crept toward the hallway. My breath was shallow, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The footsteps continued, louder now, closer, as though someone was moving just beyond the corner. I could feel the weight of the silence press in on me. "Mark!" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just the sound of those footsteps, closer now, just on the other side of the wall. I stepped into the hallway, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to turn back. I reached the corner and looked around it into the dark room, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped immediately. I exhaled in relief, but the feeling of unease didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow, thickening the air around me. The room felt colder, despite the warmth of the fire. I looked around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. No one. But then I saw it, a figure, a shadow, standing just outside the room. I couldn't make out any features, but I could tell it was tall, taller than any normal person. The shape was dark, blurred at the edges, as if it were made from the shadows themselves. It didn't move at first, it just stood there staring at me. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. Something about the figure made me feel like it was more than just a shadow. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the first move, like it knew I was too afraid to approach. And then, in the dim light, I saw something. A pair of eyes, two black, lifeless orbs that reflected no light. They stared at me, unwavering, and in that moment I felt the cold grip of pure terror. The figure took a step forward, the floor creaking under its weight. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way as panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I turned to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The shadow took another step, then another, moving slowly but deliberately toward me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. The figure simply moved closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could hear its breath now, slow, uneven, like a low growl. And then, just as I thought I was going to collapse from fear, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, guttural, and full of something darker than I could understand. It was a warning, or maybe a threat. I turned and ran for the front door, my mind screaming at me to get out, to leave, but the shadow followed me, its footsteps echoing in the dark, growing louder with every step I took. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked, but the key was inside on the table. The figure was behind me now, closer than ever, its cold breath on the back of my neck. In one final act of desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, a small vase, and threw it at the shadow. The moment it hit the floor, the figure let out a low hiss, and then, as if the world itself had turned against me, everything went black. I woke up with a start, gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, but everything was still. The fire in the fireplace had gone out, leaving the room dim and cold. The house was silent, too silent. I looked at the clock. It was past midnight, but everything felt wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, and the air felt heavy, as though something was still lurking, watching me. I quickly stood up, my legs shaking, and rushed to the door. I grabbed the handle and tried to open it, but it was locked. I checked the lock. It was fine. I had unlocked it earlier, before I'd gone to bed. Why was it locked now? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the other side of the door, as if someone had slammed into it. My heart stopped. The door shook violently, rattling in its frame. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Let me in," a voice rasped from the other side of the door. It was the same voice, the deep, guttural growl from before. My blood ran cold as I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I could feel it. Whatever was outside, it was close. It was no longer just a shadow. It had form, and it was coming for me. I ran to the window and tried to open it, but the pane wouldn't budge. I turned around, frantic, looking for an escape, but the house was closing in on me, the walls seeming to get narrower with each passing second. And then I heard it again, the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I couldn't tell if it was in my mind or if the figure was really out there, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to leave until it had me. Suddenly, the figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark hallway. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out toward me like fingers, reaching for my soul. The figure moved toward me, its eyes glowing in the dark, its shape becoming more defined as it stepped into the light. "You're mine," it hissed, and I felt its icy presence invade my mind. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed with terror. The figure reached out a long skeletal hand and touched my arm. The cold burned through me like ice spreading through my veins. I could feel the life being drained from my body, my strength fading with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure disappeared, leaving only the lingering cold behind. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The house was still. The silence was deafening. I didn't know how long I sat there, too terrified to move. But eventually, I gathered the strength to stand up and stagger toward the door. When I opened it, I was met with the quiet, empty hallway. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of the terror that had just consumed me. I left that night, abandoning the house on Sycamore Lane and never looking back. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever had been there, whatever had haunted that house, it wasn't done with me, and it would find me again. Story: Sleepwalking into Terror. I never believed in the supernatural. Growing up, I had always dismissed any spooky tales or ghost stories as mere figments of people's imaginations, but that was before the night I saw something that I still can't explain to this day. It started out like any other night. I had just moved into a new apartment on the outskirts of town. It was an old building, a converted house, and there were strange creaks and groans at night, sounds I'd grown used to after living in older buildings. I was settling in, trying to make the apartment feel like home, when strange things began happening. The first night it happened, I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing. I had no idea what had woken me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon through the curtains. I looked around the room, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. My mind told me it was just a bad dream, but there was a lingering discomfort in the air, as if I wasn't alone. I tried to lie back down, but something stopped me, a soft sound, like footsteps in the hallway. My heart began to race. My first instinct was to blame the house. Old buildings made strange noises after all, but these footsteps didn't sound like a house settling. They were rhythmic, deliberate, as if someone was walking through the apartment. I told myself it was nothing, that I had imagined it, but the sound kept getting closer. I lay still, listening, my mind racing. Then, just as I thought it was my imagination, I heard the door to my bedroom creak open. I froze. The footsteps were in my room. I waited, holding my breath, praying it was a trick of the mind. But then I felt it. A cold draft wash over me. The door was wide open, and someone, or something, was standing there. I tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came from my throat. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the figure stood there in the doorway, just out of my line of sight. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. "Come closer." I was still, my heart racing. I could hear the soft sound of breathing, slow and steady, but I couldn't bring myself to look. It felt like hours before I could finally move. But when I did, I found nothing. The room was empty. My door was open, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but it wasn't. The next few nights, the same thing happened. I would wake up to the sound of footsteps, followed by that same cold draft. I could feel the presence of someone watching me, but when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. I began to lose sleep, growing increasingly anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I tried everything to explain it away. Stress, exhaustion, maybe even a vivid imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't until I started sleepwalking that I realized something darker was at play. One night, I woke up in the middle of the living room, the dim light of the television casting strange shadows on the walls. I was standing, my body stiff, like I had been frozen in place. My heart raced as I tried to recall how I had gotten there. I had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of anything that had happened since I'd fallen asleep. As I tried to shake off the confusion, I heard the sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could see its outline, its presence. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again. "Come closer." I froze again, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing in the silence of the room. And then, just as it reached me, the lights flickered, and I blacked out. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding in my chest, my limbs heavy with an unnatural exhaustion. It was early morning and the sun had barely risen. I had no idea how I had gotten back into bed or how long I had been asleep. The memories of the night were jumbled, like fragments of a dream that didn't quite make sense. But one thing was clear. Whatever had happened, it was real. The figure, the whispers, it wasn't just in my head. That night, I decided I wouldn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in my chair by the window, trying to stay awake, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for something to happen. The apartment was eerily quiet, and the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds. But as the night wore on, exhaustion started to take over. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my best efforts, I dozed off in the chair. And that's when it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, but this time I wasn't in my bed. I was standing again, in the middle of the room, staring at the doorway. I couldn't move. I couldn't stop myself from walking forward. I watched in horror as my body moved of its own accord, stepping toward the doorway, toward the same figure that had haunted me for weeks. "Come closer," the figure whispered, its voice low and distant, like a siren calling me to the edge of a cliff. My heart raced, but my body betrayed me. I couldn't stop. I was sleepwalking, but this time it felt different. There was no control, no awareness of what I was doing. The closer I got to the figure, the more the whispers filled my ears, louder, more insistent. I reached the doorway, and as I stepped outside into the dark hallway, the world around me seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the shadows grew longer, and I felt the coldness creeping into my skin, like an icy hand wrapping around my throat. The figure stepped forward, its face now visible in the dim light. It was a hollow, dark face, its eyes black holes that seemed to stare into the deepest parts of my soul. It smiled, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. "You're mine," it said, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. In that moment, I felt something snap inside me, a deep, primal fear that took hold of my every thought. I tried to scream, to break free, but I couldn't. The more I struggled, the more the figure seemed to pull me toward it. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. I woke up again, lying in my bed. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my body was drenched in sweat. The room was quiet, the air thick with the oppressive silence that had haunted me for so long. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I knew now that whatever had been haunting me was no longer content with just whispers or shadows. It wanted me, wanted to take me into the dark, to claim me as its own. The next morning, I packed my things and left the apartment. I never went back. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, still feel the presence of the figure in the dark. I know it's waiting for me, and I fear the day when I'll sleepwalk into its grasp once again. Story: The Creepy Neighbor. I had always believed that the suburbs were supposed to be peaceful. The houses were neat and orderly, the streets quiet and empty except for the occasional dog walker or jogger. But when I moved into my new home on Elm Street, I realized that not everything was as it seemed. The house I rented was charming at first glance. It had that vintage appeal with old wooden floors, a white picket fence, and a garden full of flowers that had seen better days. It was the kind of house you see in the movies, one that you could imagine starting a family in. However, there was one thing I didn't notice when I moved in: the strange neighbor next door. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, living alone in a house that looked even older than mine. I would often see him sitting on his front porch in the early mornings, staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. His hair was graying and his clothes were worn, but it was his eyes that always bothered me. They were too intense, cold and unblinking. It wasn't long before I noticed that he was always watching me. Every time I went outside to water my plants or get the mail, I would catch him standing in his window, staring. At first I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just an old man with nothing better to do, I thought. But after a while it began to make me uneasy. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was the way he watched. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there in the shadows of his home, his eyes fixed on me like a predator. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the warm air, when I saw him again. This time, he wasn't sitting on his own porch. He was standing at the edge of his yard, just beyond the fence that separated our properties. He was staring at me, his eyes wide, his expression blank but intense. I smiled awkwardly and waved, trying to be polite, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his gaze unwavering. The next day, I had to leave the house to run some errands. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed him standing by the fence again, watching me. This time there was no sign of a friendly gesture, no smile or wave, just a blank, cold stare. It was as though he was waiting for me to leave, watching me with a strange, almost calculating look. I didn't tell anyone at first. I thought it was probably just my imagination, but then things started to get worse. Late one night, I woke up to a noise. It was a soft scratching sound, almost like something dragging against the floor. I lay there in the dark, straining to listen, but the noise stopped. I shook it off as just the house settling, but then I heard it again, closer this time, as if it were right outside my window. I looked out into the dark, but the street was empty. Just the pale light of the street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. The next morning, I found a small object on the ground by my front door. It was a note, folded neatly in half. I opened it, expecting something benign, maybe a message from a neighbor or a flyer for a local event. But when I unfolded it, my heart stopped. It read, "I know you're alone. I've been watching you. You're mine." I didn't know what to think. Who would do this? Why? I felt my skin crawl as I looked around the yard, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me again. But the yard was empty. I looked at the note again, the cold feeling of dread creeping through me. That's when I realized he had been watching me. He had been watching me every single time I stepped outside, every time I closed my blinds. I had never seen him approach the house, but he must have been there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I decided to confront him the next day. I went over to his house, walking with a mix of curiosity and fear. The door was cracked open, and I knocked, trying to calm my nerves. When he answered, I was met with his cold, piercing gaze. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice that was too calm, too measured. "I found this," I said, holding up the note. "Do you know anything about this?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked from the note to my face, then back to the note. For a long moment he didn't speak, just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I felt like I was standing in front of a wall of ice, completely helpless. Finally, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low, almost menacing. That was all he said before he closed the door in my face. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The words echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." There was something so final, so chilling about the way he had said it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The whispers continued, growing louder at night. I'd hear the same scratching noise outside my window, as if someone, or something, was dragging its nails along the brick wall. But when I looked out, there was nothing there. The unease that had been building inside me turned into full-blown terror. It felt like I was being suffocated, trapped in my own home, with nowhere to run. One night, unable to take it any longer, I decided to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and drove around aimlessly, hoping the drive would clear my mind. When I returned home hours later, I was exhausted but relieved until I saw the front door. It was wide open. I didn't remember leaving it open. I knew I had locked it when I left, but now it stood ajar, a cold breeze creeping in from the outside. I hesitated before stepping inside, every nerve in my body screaming to turn around and leave. But I had to know. I had to see if he had been in my house. I stepped through the door and froze. The place was a mess. Every drawer had been pulled out, every cabinet left wide open. The floor was littered with things that had been overturned. Books, papers, even the contents of my closet. But what caught my eye was the note, the same note from before, now pinned to the wall with a knife. "I told you not to come back," it read. I backed away, my heart racing. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, dragging closer. My breath quickened, and I spun around, but the house was empty. There was no one there. But then I heard it, the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned, and there he was, the old man, standing in the doorway, his cold eyes locked with mine, and for the first time I saw the full extent of the madness behind them. He stepped forward, his feet dragging on the floor, his gaze never leaving mine. "You shouldn't have come here," he repeated, his voice low and chilling. I turned and ran, my mind clouded with terror. But as I reached the door, I heard the sound of locks clicking shut. I turned to face him, and that's when I saw it. His face, twisted in a grotesque smile. "You're not leaving this time," he whispered. And then everything went dark. Story. The Silent Stalker. It was the kind of summer evening that you couldn't forget. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. The streets were empty, with only the occasional car passing by. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch, watching TV, when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. The knock came again, more urgent this time. I opened the door to find no one standing there, just a small white envelope on the ground. No name, no message, just an envelope. My curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to pick it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written on it. "I know where you live." I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart skipping a beat. Who would do this? It wasn't a prank. It felt too real. I looked around, but the street was empty. The only movement was the wind rustling through the trees. I tried to brush it off as a strange coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night I locked all the doors and windows, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, every creak of the house making my heart race. I kept hearing faint sounds outside my window, like footsteps in the grass. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. It felt like someone was out there, waiting. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a soft tap at my window. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still in the darkness, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But then it came again, a tap, followed by a slow, dragging noise. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, and my pulse was pounding in my ears. I dared not look out the window. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a few moments, the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breath. Then, something else happened. A faint, almost inaudible whisper came from the direction of the window. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, menacing, and chilling. I got out of bed, my body trembling, and slowly made my way to the window. I pulled back the curtains just enough to see outside, but there was no one there. Just the empty street, bathed in the pale moonlight. But the feeling of being watched lingered, suffocating me. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window, my mind spinning. The next day I tried to go about my usual routine, but the unease never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me, watching my every move. The envelope, the strange tapping on the window, it all felt connected. But to what? Why me? That night the terror escalated. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch again when I heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat, and I rushed to the kitchen to find nothing out of place. No broken dishes, no sign of anything disturbed. But then I noticed something in the corner of the room. A shadow, a figure standing in the doorway, almost blending into the darkness. I froze, my body going cold as ice. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. I could barely breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes couldn't leave the figure, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to hide. But I was paralyzed, unable to look away, unable to react. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing without a sound. I stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I stumbled backward, my mind spinning, and I rushed to lock the doors and windows again. I tried to calm myself, but my heart was still racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure had been so real. The fear it instilled in me was overwhelming. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't explain it. The days passed in a blur, each one more unnerving than the last. The envelope, the whispers, the figure. It was as if someone was toying with me. But why? And how did they know so much about me? Then, one evening, as I sat on my porch, I saw him again. The figure. This time, he was standing across the street, just outside my neighbor's house. I could barely make out his features, but I could see enough. Tall, thin, and wearing a dark hooded coat. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, even from a distance. He didn't move. He just stood there watching. And I knew then that he wasn't just some random figure. He was following me. He knew where I lived, and he was waiting for something. I spent the rest of the night inside, too terrified to leave the house. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the dark, listening to every sound in the house. The silence was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I didn't want to attract attention, didn't want him to know that I was still awake, still aware of his presence. The next morning, I did what any sane person would do. I called the police. I told them about the figure, the envelopes, the strange occurrences that had been happening for days. They listened politely, but I could tell they didn't take me seriously. I was just another person reporting a suspicious figure in the neighborhood. They promised to keep an eye on things, but I knew they wouldn't do much. They never did. That evening, I decided to leave the house, hoping that getting some fresh air would clear my head. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in my yard. This time, he was closer, close enough that I could see the faint outline of his face in the dim light. His eyes were locked on me, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for me all along. I froze, unable to move. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do, but I couldn't. I couldn't think of anything except the fear that gripped me. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled, then fell to the ground. The figure took a step forward, and in that moment, I knew he was getting closer. He was coming for me. But before he could take another step, something strange happened. A car drove by, its headlights shining brightly on the street. The figure froze in place, as though he had been paralyzed by the light. He didn't move, didn't react, and when the car passed, he was gone. I stayed on the ground for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. The fear that had gripped me was still there, a cold weight in my chest. I finally got up and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. I never saw the figure again after that night, but I know he's still out there, waiting, and I know that one day he'll come back. I can feel it. He's still watching me, and I'll never feel safe again. Story. The Disappearing Girl. It was a dull, rainy evening when I first saw her. The sky was overcast, and the kind of cold, heavy rain that drenched everything in sight had settled in for the night. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the small town library where I worked as a part-time assistant. It was a quiet evening, just like every other, and I was busy shelving books when I noticed something odd. There, by the window, stood a little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She was staring out into the rain, her back to me, her figure framed by the dull light that filtered through the thick glass. At first, I thought she must be lost, that she'd wandered in off the street, but the more I looked, the more her presence struck me as wrong. She was alone in the library, and there was something unsettling about her stillness. Curiosity got the best of me, and I walked toward her. As I approached, I could hear the soft sound of her breathing, rhythmic and steady. She didn't turn around as I called out to her. "Hey there, are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound warm and inviting, as one would to a child. She didn't answer. She just continued to stare out the window, her small hands clutching the edge of the sill as if she were holding onto something invisible. I gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to draw her attention, and that's when she finally turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wide and hollow, like the eyes of a person who had seen far too much of the world at such a young age. They were a strange shade of grey, not quite human, almost cloudy. Her face was pale, too pale, and her hair hung in damp strands around her shoulders. There was a strange emptiness to her gaze, like she was looking at me but not really seeing me at all. "I'm waiting for my mother," she said in a soft, distant voice. Her words didn't match the way she looked at me. There was no urgency in her voice, no fear that her mother hadn't shown up yet. It was as if she knew something I didn't. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as an odd moment. "Well, if you're waiting for your mum, I'm sure she'll be here soon," I said, attempting to be comforting. "Why don't you come sit down?" But she didn't move. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on me, and I could feel a strange pressure in the air, as if the room was getting smaller, the atmosphere heavier. I asked her again if she wanted to sit, but she remained perfectly still. I noticed something else then. She was holding something in her arms. A small, ragged doll, its face scratched and torn, with a small patch of what looked like dried blood on its cheek. The doll was so worn out that it barely resembled the toy it once must have been. Yet, the girl cradled it in her arms with an almost reverent gesture, rocking it back and forth as if trying to soothe it. I didn't know what to make of it, but I felt an overwhelming urge to get away from her. The atmosphere in the library was growing heavier, the whispers in my mind growing louder as I tried to make sense of the situation. My fingers ached to touch the doll, but I refrained. The little girl turned back to the window, staring once again at the endless rain, her doll still cradled in her arms. Without saying another word, I backed away slowly. I didn't want to leave her alone, but there was something about her presence that felt off. I returned to my duties, but as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the image of her from my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong about her, something unnatural. The library was nearly empty by the time the sun had fully set. I was just finishing up the last of the closing tasks when I heard a soft tap on the window. I looked up, and there she was again, standing in the exact same spot by the window, staring out into the night as if she had never moved. I thought she had left hours ago, but there she was, still watching, still waiting. I decided I had to check on her again. When I walked up to the window, I froze. The girl was no longer alone. Standing just outside the library, in the dim light from the street lamps, was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and seemed to blend into the shadows, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He stood still, unmoving, watching the little girl. And she, in turn, seemed to be waiting for him to make a move. I rushed to the door, but as I opened it, the man was gone. The little girl, too. I stepped outside, my heart racing, and scanned the street. But there was no sign of them. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I had to leave the library. I couldn't stay there another minute. But as I stepped out into the rainy night, something caught my eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper was lying by the door, wedged between the frame and the floor. I picked it up and unfolded it. It read, "I know where you are." I stood there in the doorway, the paper crinkling in my hand. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and the world around me felt like it was closing in. I couldn't believe it. This was happening to me. I glanced up at the street, hoping to see the little girl, but the road was empty. The man, too, had vanished. The paper shook in my hands, and a cold dread swept over me as I realized what it meant. Someone knew I had been watching. Someone was watching me, just as they had watched her. I didn't return to the library the next day. The unease gnawed at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I didn't know if it was fear, paranoia, or something else entirely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. The following week I received another letter, this one postmarked from a different city. Inside was a photograph of the same little girl, but this time she wasn't standing in the library. She was outside, standing in front of a building. The photo was blurry, as though it had been taken from far away, but I could make out the building behind her. It was the same building where I worked, the same street, the same place where I had seen her. But that wasn't the worst part. On the back of the photo, written in bold, hurried handwriting, was a single phrase: "You'll never be alone again." A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that whatever was happening, whatever was attached to that little girl, wasn't over. It was just beginning. A few days later, I went back to the library, hoping to find some kind of closure. I checked every corner of the building, every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of the little girl, no sign of the man, nothing. But as I was walking out, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A small, dusty doll sitting on the chair where the little girl had once sat. Its face was still twisted in that grotesque smile, and its clothes were faded and torn, just like the one the girl had held. I picked it up hesitantly, my heart thudding in my chest, and then I saw it, something hidden beneath the doll, pressed into the fabric of its dress, a note. It read, "We're waiting for you." I dropped the doll, my mind spinning, my body shaking. As I turned to run out of the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was still watching me. And I knew deep down that the little girl and the dark presence that followed her would never truly let me go. Story, locked in the attic. It was an old house, the kind that creaked with every gust of wind, with rooms that seemed to go on forever. I had just moved in, a fresh start after a long and difficult period in my life. The house was large, too large for one person, and it had been on the market for years. The owner, an elderly man, had finally sold it to me at a price too good to refuse. The moment I stepped inside, I knew there was something eerie about the place. The walls were thick, the floors worn with age, and there was a sense of abandonment that lingered in every corner. I tried to push away the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. I needed a new beginning, a peaceful place to call my own. But there was something about the house that made me uneasy, something that made me feel like I was never really alone. It was subtle at first, small things, the way the floorboards creaked even when I was standing still, the way the doors sometimes seemed to open by themselves, as if someone, or something, was watching me. The attic was the worst part of the house. I had never intended to explore it. It was locked, the door rusted and old, the key long lost to time. But something about it called to me. Every night as I lay in bed, I could hear the faint sound of scraping, something moving, slow and deliberate, coming from behind that locked door. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the scraping continued night after night. It was as if something or someone was trying to escape. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound persisted. And one night the door was slightly ajar. I couldn't resist. I had to know what was behind that door. The attic was dark, its air musty with the scent of dust and decay. I stepped into the space, the wooden floor groaning beneath my weight. The room was small, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, as though abandoned in haste. But it wasn't the furniture that caught my attention. It was the wall at the far end of the room. There was a small rusted door, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was locked, just like the attic door had been, but I could see the faint outline of something behind it. Something dark, something I couldn't quite make out. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I moved toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusty handle. The moment I touched it, the scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was on the other side knew I was there. I hesitated, unsure if I should open the door, but curiosity won out. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open. What I found behind it made my blood run cold. It was a small, cramped room, barely large enough for a person to stand. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the wood with what looked like fingernails. At the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. I could see something dark inside, something moving, something that made my stomach churn. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to leave. But then I heard it, whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The words were incomprehensible, a jumble of voices speaking at once. The whispers seemed to be coming from the chest, from the dark figure inside. Without thinking, I turned and ran, slamming the attic door behind me. I stumbled down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew I had to leave. The house, the attic, the whispers, it was too much. I couldn't stay, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was in that attic, whatever was behind that locked door, was following me. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to return. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the whispers, faint and distant, drifting through the walls like a haunting melody. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure inside the chest, its eyes glowing in the dim light, its mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. The thought of going back to the attic filled me with an icy dread, but I knew that I couldn't leave things as they were. Something was wrong with the house, and I had to know what it was. I spent the next day in a daze, my mind racing with thoughts of the attic, the chest, and the dark figure inside. I tried to shake the feeling, to focus on the mundane tasks of unpacking and settling in, but it was impossible. The house was too silent, too oppressive, and the whispers wouldn't stop. That evening, I found myself standing in front of the attic door again. My hand hovered over the handle, my heart thudding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Maybe I was hoping that it had all been a nightmare, that the house would be just as empty and quiet as it had been before. But deep down I knew the truth. Something dark was buried in this house, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I opened the door, the creak echoing through the silence. The attic was exactly as I had left it, dark, musty, and suffocating. The small room in the back, the one with the strange symbols on the walls, was still there, its presence as unnerving as before. But this time, I was determined to face whatever was hiding in that chest. I moved toward the chest, my steps slow and deliberate. The whispers were louder now, their words more distinct, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was as if they were urging me to open the chest, to release whatever was trapped inside. I didn't want to do it. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave the house and never come back, but my hands moved on their own, reaching for the lid of the chest. As I lifted the lid, the temperature in the room dropped, the air growing colder with every second. Inside the chest, there was nothing but darkness. I peered into it, trying to make out any shape, any movement, but the darkness was overwhelming. And then I felt it, something cold and clammy brushing against my fingers, something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled my hand back with a scream, stumbling backward, but the darkness in the chest didn't recede. It swirled and twisted, as if it had a life of its own, drawing me closer, pulling me in. I tried to move to get away, but the room seemed to close in on me. The walls were shifting, the air was thick, and the whispers were deafening. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes glowing in the darkness, staring directly at me. They were hollow, empty, like two black pits, and they seemed to be pulling me in, suffocating me with their gaze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped in the attic, trapped in the darkness with whatever was in that chest. The last thing I remember is the whispers growing louder, more frantic, until they drowned out everything else. The darkness consumed me, and I fell into it, my mind slipping away as I was pulled into the abyss. Story: The Mirror in the Hallway. It was an ordinary house, or at least that's what I told myself when I first moved in. The walls were painted a neutral shade of cream, the floors were hardwood, and the furniture was mostly second-hand. But there was one thing that I never could explain: the old mirror in the hallway. I'd found it tucked away in the attic, covered in dust, behind some old boxes. At first I wasn't even sure it was a mirror. The glass had been so clouded, the frame so worn, that it looked more like an ancient relic than something you would hang on your wall. But something about it intrigued me. I decided to clean it up, to see if it could be restored to its former glory. The moment I wiped away the grime and dust from the surface, I regretted it. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't mine. I couldn't explain it. It was me, but it wasn't. My reflection was wrong. The colors in the glass were distorted, like an old photograph that had been left out in the sun for too long. The edges of my reflection were blurry, and I could feel my heart rate pick up as I stared into the depths of the mirror. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the old glass playing tricks on my eyes, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt watched. I couldn't bring myself to take the mirror down. Something kept me rooted in place, as if it were calling me, compelling me to keep it hanging in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. The next night, I woke up to a strange feeling. My room was pitch black, the only light coming from the small sliver of moonlight that crept in through the blinds. But there, at the edge of my vision, was the faintest glow. I turned toward it, my heart racing, and there it was, the mirror. It was glowing. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the glow was too intense, too unnatural. My body refused to move, as if the mirror was pulling me toward it, drawing me in with an unseen force. I got out of bed slowly, my legs trembling, and walked toward the hallway. As I approached the mirror, the glow intensified, casting long shadows on the walls. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I didn't want to look into it. I didn't want to face whatever it was that had been calling me, but I couldn't stop myself. I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection now sharp and clear. But there was something different about it. My reflection wasn't still, it was moving. Slowly, it raised its hand, mirroring my own movements. But then it did something I didn't do. It grinned, a wide, twisted grin that stretched across my face, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. My reflection was smiling at me, but it wasn't me. It wasn't my smile. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, but the reflection in the mirror didn't stop. It stepped forward, as though it was coming through the glass toward me. I staggered back, but the reflection continued to move toward me, its eyes now glowing with a malevolent light. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was something else, something alive. I turned and ran for the door, but as I reached the handle, I heard a sound behind me, the whisper. It came from the mirror, low and cold, like a breath on the back of my neck. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice distorted, unrecognizable. I didn't look back. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, but I could still hear it, faintly, in the distance, the voice from the mirror. It was getting louder, closer. "You can't escape." I spent the rest of the night awake, the fear gripping me so tightly that I could barely move. The mirror had been calling to me, drawing me in with its dark presence. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. The mirror wasn't just an object. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for me. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go near it. I stayed in my room, avoiding the hallway as much as I could. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I could hear the faint whispers sometimes, just as I had the night before. And every time I closed my eyes, I could see the reflection of that twisted grin in the darkness. I decided to leave the house. I had to get away from that mirror, from whatever it was that was haunting me. I gathered a few things, planning to stay with a friend for a while, but just as I was about to leave, I heard it again. The whisper. It was coming from the hallway. "No one leaves," it said. I stood frozen in place. The voice was louder now, clearer. And this time, it wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from the hallway itself, as if the very house was speaking to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned toward the door. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. I knew I had to face it. I had to confront whatever it was that had been watching me, following me. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the hallway, my hands shaking. When I reached the mirror, it was worse than before. The glow was now blinding, filling the entire room with an unnatural light. My reflection was there, but this time it wasn't just standing still. It was reaching out, its hand pressing against the glass, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. And then it spoke. "You can never leave," it said. "You belong to me now." I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but the mirror didn't stop. The glass began to ripple, the surface warping like water, and before I could react, I felt the coldness seep into the air around me. In the blink of an eye, the reflection in the mirror was no longer a reflection. It was something alive, its face now emerging from the glass, its twisted grin stretching wider as it reached out toward me. I turned and ran. My feet felt heavy, as if the house itself was trying to hold me back. I heard the sound of something scraping, dragging across the floor, and I knew it was following me. The reflection was no longer contained within the glass. It was coming for me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran out of the house and into the night, the cold air hitting my face, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel the presence behind me, closing in, and I knew I couldn't escape it. The mirror had followed me. The reflection, whatever it was, had followed me. And I knew deep down that I would never truly be free. Story. The Strangers at Midnight. It had been a long, exhausting day at work, and I was looking forward to a peaceful evening at home. The apartment was quiet, as usual, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I had a simple dinner, watched a bit of TV, and then retreated to my bedroom, eager to get some sleep. The clock on my nightstand read 11:45 p.m. As I settled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, the room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside the window. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard a faint sound, a knocking maybe, or a distant voice, but I brushed it off as my imagination. The sound came again, louder this time. I froze, my heart racing. It was a knocking, but it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. I stared at the glass, my mind struggling to process the noise. There was no one out there, no one who should be there. I had checked the locks on the windows before bed, so why was someone knocking? I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. The knocking continued, rhythmic, as though someone was tapping lightly on the window. I pulled the curtains aside, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. No one standing there, no shadowy figure in the dark. I sighed in relief, shaking my head. It must have been the wind or some other noise that had tricked my ears. I turned to walk back to the bed, but then I saw it. In the reflection of the window, there was something standing behind me. A figure. It was a tall man dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. His features were indistinct, blurred by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me. My heart stopped, and for a moment I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to look away from the reflection. I spun around, but when I turned, there was nothing. The room was empty. I rushed to the door, unlocking it and looking into the hallway, but there was no one there either. The entire apartment was silent again. I thought I had imagined it, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But then I heard it again. The knocking, louder now, more urgent. I quickly ran to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. No one in the hallway, no sign of anyone standing outside my door. But the knocking continued. It wasn't coming from the door anymore, though. It was coming from the walls. Soft, rhythmic taps, like someone was standing right next to me, just beyond the drywall, waiting for me to make the first move. My breathing quickened as panic began to set in. I felt trapped, like I was being watched from all sides. I couldn't make sense of it. The knocking wasn't real. It couldn't be. And then, as I stood there, frozen, I heard the voice. It was faint at first, just a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Someone was speaking to me. "You're not alone." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it seemed to come from all around me, as though it were coming from the walls, the ceiling, and the floor at once. It sent a wave of terror through me, and I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to escape, but where would I go? The apartment building was old, the walls thin, and the hallway empty. I had no way of knowing who or what was outside, watching me. The voice came again, louder this time. "We're waiting!" I couldn't take it anymore. The fear had taken over, and I felt like I was suffocating. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what was happening. Who were they? What did they want from me? I had to leave the apartment, but I was too afraid to open the door. If I opened it, I knew that I would face whatever was on the other side, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. The knocking intensified, the sound now echoing through the walls, louder and more frantic. It wasn't just one person. It sounded like multiple people, all knocking in unison, all trying to get my attention. I clutched my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper as I explained the situation. But before I could finish, the line went dead. I looked at my phone, confused, and tried to redial, but the signal was gone. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. now. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, whatever was knocking at my door, was not going to stop. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. Suddenly, the apartment grew colder. I could see my breath in the air, a white mist that formed every time I exhaled. The knocking stopped, and the voice came again, this time louder and clearer. "We know you're there." My blood ran cold. I felt like I was suffocating, as though the walls of the apartment were closing in on me. I couldn't escape. I was trapped, and there was nowhere to run. I backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. I knew they were coming for me. They were closing in. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and I heard the handle rattle. My heart leapt in my chest as the door creaked, the locks shaking. Whoever was on the other side was trying to get in. I quickly ran to the window and pushed it open, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just outside the window, was a man. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, and he was staring directly at me. His mouth twisted into a sickening grin as he slowly raised his hand and tapped on the glass. He wasn't alone. Behind him, there were more figures, their faces obscured by shadows, all standing silently, watching me. They were waiting for me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence that had taken over the apartment. The footsteps outside the door started again, this time getting louder, faster, as if they were closing in on me. I knew there was no escape. The last thing I remember was the sound of the door crashing open and the cold, heavy weight of something grabbing my arm. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the door wide open, the hallway empty. The knocking had stopped. The figures were gone, but I knew they were still out there, and I knew that one day they would come back. Story: The Lost Child. The air was thick with mist that evening. The streets were damp, the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves hanging in the air as I walked home from work. It was nearing dusk, and the fading sunlight barely managed to break through the heavy clouds. The weather had been like this for days, overcast, dreary, and oppressive. As I passed by the park on my way home, I noticed something unusual. A little girl was sitting on the swing, alone. She was small, no older than 5 or 6, her hair dark and messy as it hung in strands over her face. She was wearing a bright red coat, which seemed out of place in the muted greyness of the world around her. At first, I thought it was just a child waiting for her parents, but then I realized something. The park was empty. There were no other children, no parents walking around, no one nearby. The silence was almost unbearable. I looked around, wondering if I had missed something, but the streets were empty. The park, though usually busy with people, seemed deserted. I approached cautiously, my curiosity piqued, but there was something in the way she sat, her stillness, her silence, that sent a chill down my spine. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Where are your parents?" The little girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She just kept swinging back and forth, her legs dangling slightly as she moved with the rhythm of the swing. I took a few more steps toward her, but when I reached the edge of the playground, I hesitated. Something about her behavior unsettled me. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer now. Still no response. It was as if she didn't hear me at all. The swing creaked on its own, the soft sound cutting through the quiet of the evening. "Hey, sweetie," I tried again, this time a little more urgently. "Where are your parents?" "It's getting late." That's when she finally looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and vacant, almost too wide, like they'd never blinked. And her gaze, it was empty, distant. She didn't speak. She simply stared at me. And for a moment, I felt like I was no longer standing in a park, but somewhere else entirely. The world around us seemed to blur, the mist thickening as if it were closing in on us. I didn't know why, but I felt a compulsion to walk away, to get away from this child, this strange, unsettling presence. My feet moved before I even thought about it, and just as I turned to leave, I heard her voice, a soft, raspy whisper that made my blood run cold. "Don't leave. I need you." I froze in place, my heart skipping a beat. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. There was something wrong with her. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that voice, that eerie whisper, wasn't coming from a normal child. It was like a plea from something far darker, far older than I could understand. I turned back around slowly, but when I looked at the swing, the little girl was gone. The park was empty again, the swing swaying gently in the wind, the only sign that anyone had been there. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. I looked around again, but there was no sign of her. No trace, no footprints, no sounds. Just the soft wind and the mist creeping along the ground. It felt like I had just imagined it all, like the child had never been there in the first place. I hurried home that night, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the emptiness in her eyes, but I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird encounter, something that could be explained away by exhaustion or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with that child, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I returned to the park, hoping to find some answers. Maybe it was just a child who had gotten separated from her parents. Maybe there was an explanation. But when I arrived, the park was empty, just like it had been the night before. There was no sign of the swing, no sign of anyone at all. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years, the equipment old and rusted. But the strange part was this. As I stood there, staring at the empty park, I heard something. A sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves in the trees. But then, as I listened, the sound became clearer. It was a child's laughter, soft and high-pitched, echoing through the empty park. I turned around, my pulse quickening, but again, I saw nothing. No one. Just the wind, the trees, and the empty playground. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something or someone was out there, hidden, waiting for me to turn around. The laughter echoed in my ears, but it wasn't coming from any of the nearby children, because there were none. I glanced around again, feeling more paranoid, more frightened with every passing second. Was it just in my head? Was I imagining things? But then I saw her. She was standing in the distance, at the far end of the park, just standing there. The same little girl, her red coat standing out against the dark backdrop of the trees. She wasn't moving, just watching me with those same vacant eyes. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How was she here again? How could she be in two places at once? The image of her face, twisted with that unsettling, hollow gaze, was burned into my memory. I took a step toward her, my mind screaming at me to turn and leave, but my body wasn't listening. I walked closer, drawn to her by some force I didn't understand. The laughter grew louder, now sounding like it was all around me, swirling in the air, the trees and the ground beneath my feet. And then, as I approached, something changed. The little girl turned and began walking away from me, but it wasn't the slow, carefree walk of a child. It was fast, too fast. She moved in long strides, her small legs making her appear almost unnatural as she darted between the trees, her red coat flickering in the dim light like a ghost. I ran after her, calling out to her, asking if she needed help, but she didn't answer. Her laughter echoed louder and louder, taunting me, beckoning me deeper into the park. By the time I reached the trees, she was gone, vanished without a trace. I stopped, panting, looking around wildly, but she was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of her anywhere. But then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps behind me, growing louder. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the park was still empty. The trees stood silent, the swing swaying gently in the wind. I turned back around, my mind reeling, but that's when I saw it. In the shadows of the trees, just beyond the park's fence, there was something else. Another figure, a tall, dark silhouette watching me. Its eyes were glowing, reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. And in the distance, the little girl's laughter came again, echoing from all directions. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my legs aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were following me. The shadows, the laughter, the figure, it was all closing in, and I knew deep down that I had made a terrible mistake. I had followed her, and now I was lost. Story: The Evil in the Basement. When I moved into the old Victorian house, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The house was large, beautiful in a crumbling, neglected way, with old wooden beams and a heavy, lingering scent of dust. It had been on the market for a while, and the price was too good to pass up. I had always wanted a house with character, something to call my own. Little did I know that this house had more character than I could handle. The house had 3 floors, but the basement was the most mysterious part. I had heard rumors from the neighbors about strange happenings in the house, but I dismissed them as local gossip, the kind of things people talk about when they have nothing better to do. I ignored the cold shiver that ran down my spine every time I walked past the basement door. It was locked when I first moved in, but the key was soon handed to me by the landlord, who seemed far too eager to get rid of the house. "Don't go down there, unless you really have to," he told me, his voice shaking slightly, as if he was warning me about something far more serious than just a creepy old basement. I laughed it off, thinking he was just being dramatic. What was the worst that could happen in a basement? It was just a storage space, after all. But the curiosity grew, gnawing at me every time I passed the door. One day, after a few weeks of living there, I couldn't stand it any longer. The door to the basement was calling me, and I knew I had to see what was behind it. I unlocked the door, the old metal creaking loudly as it swung open. The stairs led down into complete darkness, and I hesitated for a moment. The air felt different, cooler, heavier, as though the darkness itself was waiting for me. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding, and started down the stairs. The beams of light from the flashlight flickered against the walls as I descended, casting strange shadows on the old stone. The basement was larger than I expected, filled with forgotten furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked high with things I didn't recognize. But there was something else in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The basement felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to be behind me. As I ventured further into the room, I noticed an old wooden chest in the corner. It was strange. It didn't belong with the other discarded furniture. The chest was pristine, untouched by time. I approached it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the latch. Before I could open it, I heard something, a low, guttural sound like something breathing. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder, and I could feel the temperature dropping, despite the fact that it was a warm summer evening. I turned slowly, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and I took a step back. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving quickly across the far wall. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough. I felt my heart stop. I turned to run up the stairs, but the door at the top slammed shut as if someone had locked it from the outside. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but there was no answer. The only sound was the whisper of the wind outside and the soft, steady thumping of my own heartbeat. I turned back to the basement, and that's when I saw the chest again. It was open now, the lid cracked just slightly. I didn't remember opening it. But I knew something was in there. Something that shouldn't be. The air was thick, suffocating. The room felt like it was closing in on me. the shadows stretching, reaching for me. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls. "You shouldn't have come," the voice hissed. I stepped back from the chest, my breath quickening. The whispers were growing louder, and the shadows seemed to move, alive with a malevolent energy. I could feel something watching me, something more than just a presence in the room. The walls themselves seemed to close in, tightening around me. I tried the door again, but it was still locked. Panic started to set in, the air thick with fear. I could feel my pulse racing as I turned back to the chest, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder, now coming from all directions, from the walls, the floor, and the chest itself. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice whispered, now much clearer, much closer. "Now it's too late." I couldn't breathe. The room was suffocating, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then I saw it, a shape slowly emerging from the chest, like something crawling its way out from the depths of the earth. At first, it was just a blur, a dark, twisting figure that seemed to move in and out of focus, like smoke, like a shadow. And then it became clearer. It was a man, or at least it used to be. His face was contorted, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth open in a silent scream. His skin was decayed, hanging loosely from his bones, and his body was unnaturally thin, like a skeleton wrapped in tattered flesh. He reached out with long, bony fingers, dragging himself out of the chest with terrifying speed. I backed away, stumbling over boxes, my mind scrambling for any way out. But there was no escape. The figure moved toward me with unnatural speed, its head twisting at odd angles, its limbs jerking and twitching as though it was both alive and dead at the same time. "You opened the chest," it rasped. "Now you belong to me." I ran, throwing myself at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its ragged breathing loud in my ears. I turned around, my mind racing for a way out, but the room was shifting. The walls seemed to close in on me, the darkness swallowing up the light. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my arm, and I screamed. The cold, rotting touch sent waves of nausea through my body, and I felt the strength drain from my limbs. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure was pulling me closer, its grip tightening. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the basement, lying on the cold, hard floor. The chest was closed now, locked tightly. The whispers were gone, the air still and silent. But the feeling of something watching me, something waiting, still lingered. I never returned to that basement. I moved out of the house the very next day, leaving everything behind. I don't know if what I saw was real or just a figment of my imagination, but I can still feel that cold touch on my skin. I can still hear the whispers haunting me from the shadows, and I know one thing for sure. The evil in the basement is still there, waiting for someone else to open the chest. Story. The Haunted Forest. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had heard them. The warnings, the ghost stories, the strange disappearances that were whispered about late at night. The forest had always been a place of mystery, shrouded in superstition and fear. But like most people, I dismissed it as local folklore, exaggerated tales told by old folks who were too quick to jump to conclusions. That was until I went camping there. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway with some friends, a way to escape the chaos of city life. We had planned to hike tell ghost stories around the campfire, and enjoy the peace of the wilderness. But none of us were prepared for what we would encounter. The forest was dense, the trees towering over us, blocking out much of the sunlight. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something wrong about this place. The trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab us. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by thick underbrush. The ground was soft, damp with the humidity of the forest. As we sat around the fire that evening, I noticed how quiet it was. There were no sounds of wildlife, no chirping of crickets or rustling of leaves. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Do you guys ever wonder why no one comes out here anymore?" my friend Sam asked, breaking the silence. We all looked at him, a little confused. Sam was the type to joke around, always light-hearted, even in the creepiest situations. But this time, he didn't seem to be joking. "I mean, it's weird, right?" he continued. "This forest is huge, and yet no one really comes out here. People used to camp here, hike, but now it's like it's abandoned." I shrugged it off, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. "It's just an old forest," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Things change, that's all." But as the night wore on, the sense of unease only grew stronger. We stayed close to the fire, talking in hushed voices, our shadows dancing wildly on the trees. I glanced around, my eyes darting between the trees, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the circle of light. At first I thought it was one of my friends, playing a prank. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs. It stood perfectly still, as if watching us. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but its presence felt cold, wrong. I gasped, and the others immediately turned toward where I was staring, but when they looked, the figure was gone. There was nothing but the trees swaying gently in the wind. No one else had seen it. I felt the blood drain from my face as I tried to explain away what I had just seen. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. But the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. We tried to go to sleep, but none of us could. The fear had taken root, gnawing at the edges of our minds. Every creak of the forest, every snap of a twig, made our hearts race. We were trapped in that small clearing, surrounded by darkness and the unknown. I don't know how long I lay there, staring into the dark, but it felt like hours. That's when I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper carried by the wind. But then it grew louder. I could hear words, no, names, being spoken, as if someone or something was calling us by name. "Come closer," the voice whispered, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping, echoing in the trees. "Come to us!" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The others heard it too. We all lay there, wide-eyed and terrified, not daring to move. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up as the voices grew louder, more frantic. The words were unintelligible, a mix of whispers and shrill cries that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. We waited, breathless, hoping that it was over, but the silence that followed was worse, deeper. The air had grown heavier, thicker with something unseen. The trees around us felt like they were closing in, their branches scratching against each other in the wind, like dry fingers tapping against glass. I don't know how much time passed, but soon we realized we weren't alone. We weren't alone. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The shadows seemed to move, shifting and twisting in the corners of my vision. But when I looked directly at them, they were still. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if the forest itself was alive and it had turned its attention on us. Suddenly, there was a rustling in the bushes behind us, a low, grating sound that sent us all jumping to our feet. We turned, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the thick brush moving as though something had passed through it. "Let's go," Sam said, his voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." We didn't hesitate. We packed up our things in a frantic rush, our hands trembling as we tried to gather our gear. But as we were about to leave, the forest seemed to come alive around us. The air grew colder, and the rustling grew louder, as if something or someone was following us. We began to walk faster, then ran, our hearts pounding as the sounds behind us intensified. It felt like the very ground beneath us was shifting, as if the forest itself was moving to trap us. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches twisting and creaking like skeletal arms reaching for us. Then we saw it, a figure standing in the distance just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall, with long, gnarled limbs that stretched out of the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was unmistakable. It was watching us. We ran faster, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Every turn we made, every path we tried to follow, led us deeper into the woods. We were lost. The whispers, the voices, were back again, echoing in our ears, urging us to come closer. I could feel something behind us, something that moved faster than we could run. It was gaining on us, its footsteps heavy and quick, the ground beneath us trembling with each step. We finally made it to the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified, but when we turned back, there was nothing there. The figure, the voices, the movement, everything was gone. We never spoke of that night again. The forest was never the same after that. We left the town, each of us haunted by the memory of what we had seen and heard. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever is in that forest, whatever watches from the shadows, is still there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander too far. And I know that if you ever venture near the forest at night, you'll hear the whispers too. You'll hear the call, Story. The shadow under my bed. It started innocently enough, like most terrifying things do, quietly, just a whisper in the corner of your mind, unnoticed until it's too late. I was just a child when I first saw it. I was 10, the kind of age where the world still feels magical, but starts to lose its wonder at the same time. My room was at the end of the hallway, tucked away in the corner of the house. It was small, with an old wooden floor that creaked underfoot, and a single window that let in a sliver of moonlight each night. The room was quiet, always still, but something about it felt wrong, unsettling, like something had been there long before I ever moved in. I used to be terrified of the dark. Every night I would pull the covers over my head, burying myself in a cocoon of blankets, trying to block out the shadows that danced along the walls. But no matter how tightly I wrapped myself up, I could always feel it. the presence. I remember the first night I saw it. I had been tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a faint scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. I thought it was just my imagination, the house settling, but then the sound came again, closer this time, louder, more deliberate. It was coming from under my bed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and I dared not move. I had heard stories of monsters living under the bed, creatures that would reach up and grab you if you weren't careful. I used to laugh at those stories, but now, as the sound grew louder, more persistent, I wasn't so sure. The scraping stopped suddenly, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and then I heard it, a soft, rasping whisper coming from directly under my bed. "Come closer," it said, the voice low and slow, like it was trying to lure me into its grasp. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't stop the scream that escaped my lips. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing, my body trembling. The whispering continued, growing louder, the voice now accompanied by faint, heavy breathing. I didn't dare look. I knew in the deepest part of my mind that if I looked under the bed, I would see something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I turned on the light, desperate to chase away the darkness, but when I looked down at the floor, there was nothing there. Just the shadows, still and unmoving. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a bad dream. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The next morning, I told my parents, but they brushed it off. "It's just your imagination, sweetie," they said. "There's nothing under your bed." But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had heard. The whispers continued, night after night, and with them, something else grew stronger. The feeling that I wasn't alone in my room, that something was watching me. The shadows seemed to grow darker, deeper, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, the presence. And then one night, it happened. I woke up to find my covers ripped off, my body exposed to the cold air. The whispers were louder now, and I could feel something moving in the dark, just beyond the edge of my vision. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the shadows shifting, swirling. I looked down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. A figure, crouching under my bed. It was tall, too tall for something that was supposed to fit under there, its long, spindly limbs stretching out, its face hidden in the dark. But I could see its eyes, dark, empty pits that seemed to stare directly at me. Its grin was wide, too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, my body frozen in fear as the figure slowly, deliberately, crawled out from under the bed, its limbs twitching and jerking like a broken puppet. And then it spoke. "I've been waiting." I couldn't move. The words sent a chill through me, freezing me in place. My body felt like it was made of stone, incapable of reacting, incapable of doing anything but stare at the creature crawling out from under my bed. Its grin grew wider as it crawled closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the air grow colder, the room becoming heavier, as if the weight of its presence was pressing down on me. It was impossible to look away from those eyes, those empty pits that seemed to devour everything in their path. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. My body refused to respond, as if it had been overtaken by some invisible force. The creature reached out, its long fingers brushing against my foot. I felt the cold touch, icy and sharp, like it was seeping into my very skin, freezing me from the inside out. I gasped for air, my chest tight with fear, but no sound escaped my lips. The creature was too close now, its face just inches from mine, its breath foul and ragged. And then it whispered again, "You can't escape me." I don't know how I managed to break free from the paralysis, but in that moment, something inside me snapped. I kicked out with all my strength, sending the creature sprawling backward. I didn't look back as I bolted from my bed, running toward the door, my heart racing. The hallway light flickered on as I stumbled into the corridor, gasping for air, my mind still spinning. But when I looked back into my room, there was nothing there. The bed was empty. The shadows were still. The whispers had stopped. I told my parents again, but they just chalked it up to nightmares. They insisted I was just imagining things, that nothing was in my room. But I knew the truth. The creature, the shadow, had been real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, still watching me from the shadows. I stayed awake all night, the fear gnawing at me, knowing that it hadn't left. It had only waited. For days, I couldn't sleep, couldn't rest. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep the light on, but the darkness would always creep in, always find its way back. The creature, the shadow under my bed, would return, night after night, whispering in the dark. And then, one night, I woke up again. The covers had been ripped off, and I was lying exposed in the cold air once more. I turned to look, and I saw it again. The figure was crouched by the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing in the dark, but this time it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Shadows, dark and twisted, all gathered around my bed, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, waiting. I heard the whisper again, this time coming from all around me. "You should have never looked." And then they reached out,